Well, hello. How are you doing? Hey, it's your old pal JP, and once again we're here live at the Howard. Where are we? we're in Biloxi, Mississippi, at the Porter Street Studios, and so I'm filling in for Julie. So I'm doing a broadcast today. We're continuing the individuation series here, and I should check to see. Okay, looks like we look good. We're on. We're live. Everyone can hear me. Okay, I think. Looks like the microphone is working. Okay, cool. Well, so today we're going to talk about as part of the individuation series. We're going to talk about a guy named Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was he was a Catholic German theologian, and he was also a monk and a priest. He was an abbot, and it says here in the basic description in our show notes that he was born in 1260 and died in 1328. So he basically lived and died about 700 years ago. So he was born about around 700 years, or I was born around 700 years after him, and he died around 700 years ago. So in 1328. So we're in 2026. He was German theologian whose radical and mystical teachings on the soul's oneness with God, his focus on detachment and the spark of the soul suggested direct, unmediated union with the divine, challenging conventional notions of individual and separate identity. I'm going to go to the Wikipedia entry because that's basically what I kind of have. I want to give you a little background, though, why I'm talking about Meister Eckhart. In our research, Julian and I have been looking into Jungian theory and of psychology, and his name came up in one of the entries, and I have some quotes actually from Carl Jung about Meister Eckhart. I'll get into that in a little bit, but first let's kind of look at who he is. Let's see if this is the right one. Nope. Maybe. Let's see. Oh, I've got a lot of tabs open here that I don't need. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go up here. So here he is. Yeah, there he is. Okay. Okay. So Meister Eckhart, his first name was Eckhart, last name von Hockheim, commonly known as Meister Eckhart. The claimed original name was Johannes, but later they kind of like negate that. He was a German Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher, and mystic. He was born near Gotha in Landgravitat of Thuringia, which is in central Germany. Eckhart came into prominence during the Avignon papacy at the time of increased tensions between monastic orders, diocesan, so that's the local churches, diocesan clergy, and the Franciscan order, and Eckhart's Dominican order. So there was some rift between the Franciscans and the Dominicans. By the way, I was taught by Dominican sisters. I think the priests at my school were also at the church were also Dominican. But anyway, in later life, he was accused of heresy and brought up before the local Franciscan-led, see the Franciscans, they were going after him, Franciscan-led Inquisition, and tried as a heretic by Pope John the 22nd, with the bull in Agro Dominico of March 27, 1329. In the trial, excerpts of his Book of Divine Consolation were used against Eckhart. He seems to have died before the verdict was received, so he didn't die a heretic. They weren't able to put a decree of heresy on him. He could have been burned at the stake, so I think God's grace shined on him and allowed him to die because heretics at the time were in fact burned at the stake. He was well known for his work with pious lay groups such as Friends of God, and I looked into the Friends of God, and they were a group that formed after his death. and two, I believe, let's see, at least um, one of the founders of Friends of God was actually burned at the stake as a heretic. So awesome history of the Catholic Church, of which I belong, but or at least was baptized into, and was succeeded by his more circumspect disciples, Johannes Thaler and Henry Suso, the latter of whom was beatified, which basically means, according to the Catholic Church, he was allowed to enter heaven and capacity to intercede on behalf of individuals who pray in their name. So basically, I guess sainthood. I never quite got that, if that was the case or not. Anyway, so let's see. He has acquired a status as a great mystic within contemporary popular spirituality, as well as considerable interest from scholars situating him within the medieval scholastic and philosophical tradition. There's a lot of I don't know if there's an argument or just kind of a consternation in like where he gets placed. Some historians and theologians and people who maybe even philosophers claim he's a mystic, and others claim he is strictly a theologian. And I don't know why you can't have both, but there's also people who have linked him to Eastern philosophies, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. But before I go into his life, and I don't know if I really want to go too far into his life, it's kind of interesting though. Actually, no, let's talk about his career, and I'm not going to go too far into it, but he joined the Dominican Covenant when he was about 18, and it's assumed he studied at Cologne before 1280, and he also may have studied at the University of Paris, either before or after his time in Cologne. And one of the historians that I was reading about, placed him into the sort of like the scholastic, university tradition, rather than just simply being considered a mystic. So that's kind of where things were with how they see him historically. In 1303, Eckhart returned to Erfurt and was given the position of provincial superior for Saxony, a province which reached at that time from the Netherlands to Livonia. Thereby, he had responsibility for 47 convents in the region. So he was basically, in charge of all the abbeys and all the convents. Complaints made against the provincial superior of Teutonia and him at the Dominican General Chapter held in Paris in 1306 concerning irregularities among the ternaries. I don't know what that is. I guess his writings must have been trivial, because the General Emeric of Piacenza appointing him in the following year as his vicar general for Bohemia, with full power to set the demoralized monasteries there in order. So basically, I guess there were a lot of. So let me just kind of put this into context as well. Going back up, we were talking about Avignon, or they mentioned Avignon. So Avignon is the is where the papacy was located, and it was under the thumb of the crown of France. So basically, the Kingdom of France kind of ran the papacy at the time. And at that time, there was also derision between the regular sort of churches, where the priests that oversaw the church going public, as it were, and of the monastic orders, but also between the papacy and the monastic orders. So there was a lot of tension going on at the time. The Inquisitions were going on. There were people who were considered inquisitors, right? And Eckhart actually lived with one at some point in his life. He was, because of his positioning, because of his writings, he later, at the end of his life, was actually brought up, as I mentioned, as a as a trial. He was tried for heresy by the Pope. And later he's been rehabilitated, as it were, within the Catholic Church. The last Pope, what was his name? Francis, the German Pope, kind of brought him back into favor before he actually became a Pope. So anyway, so let's see. This is a bit on heresy, but I want to talk about. So here's rehabilitation. His status in contemporary Catholic Church has been uncertain. The Dominican order pressed in the last decade of the 20th century for his full rehabilitation and confirmation of his theological orthodoxy. John Paul II voiced favorable opinion, and then, of course, as I mentioned, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. I'm sorry, not Francis. He was the last one, right? Yeah, okay, or the current one, last one. I don't know. I can't keep track of these guys. Our current Pope is an American now, I guess. So anyway, all right. So influences. Eckhart was schooled in medieval scholasticism and was well acquainted with Aristotelism and Augustinianism. Do I have that right? Augustinianism. So Augustine. The Neoplatonism and pseudo-Dionysus and this word always kills me, Areopagite, I guess is what it is. My little French accent on that. Asserted a great influence on him. And I looked up pseudo-Dionysus, and he was a Greek author, Christian theologian, and Neoplatonic philosopher of the late 5th to early 6th century. Mystical theology, basically. Interesting guy. And there were some other people that got mentioned, in my readings about him, but about, everything about pseudo-Dionysus, as well as there was a guy, he comes up later. What's his name? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so interesting stuff. Asserted great influence on him, and as reflected his notions on the Gothiet, beyond the God who can be named. So we'll get into that in a second here. So his teachings, sermons. Although he was an accomplished academic theologian, Eckhart's best remembered works are his highly unusual sermons in the vernacular German language rather than in the usual Latin. So up until the early 1960s, the Mass, the Catholic Mass, was always in Latin, and I imagine so were the sermons, which is odd because how do you understand language sermonizing to you when you don't understand the language? But anyway, we're talking 700 years ago. This was very unusual for the sermon to be spoken in the vernacular of the people that he was speaking to, right? Eckhart, so that in and of itself probably raised a lot of eyebrows within the church, and got him on the radar, the pre-modern radar of the medieval period. Eckhart, as a preaching friar, attempted to guide his flock as well as monks and nuns under his jurisdiction with practical sermons on spiritual, psychological transformation and a New Testament metaphorical content related to the creative power inherent in disinterest, or in other words, dispassion, or what is known as detachment. The central theme of Eckhart's German sermons is the presence of God in the individual soul and the dignity of the soul of the just man. Although he elaborated on his theme, he rarely departed from it. In one sermon, Eckhart gives the following summary of his message. When I preach, I usually speak of detachment and say that a man should be empty of the self and all things. And secondly, that he should be reconstructed in the simple good that is God. And thirdly, that he should consider the great aristocracy which God has set up in the soul. So when we talk about, self, just lost the word, sovereignty of the self, I think this is what we can really point to is, Julie and I have problems with the idea of aristocracy, but given the context of his period of time, I think that was, how he was thinking of, like, within one's soul. Um, he considers it like the great aristocracy which God has set up in the soul, such that by means of it man may wonderfully attain God. So through this aristocracy within the self sovereignty, one can accept and attain God. And fourthly, the purity of the divine nature. So, um, well, basically divine nature. I don't know. As Eckhart said in his trial defense, his sermons were meant to inspire listeners the desire above all to do some good. In this, he frequently used unusual language and seemed to stray from the path of orthodoxy, which made him suspect to the church during the tense years of the Avignon papacy. In Eckhart's vision, God is primarily fecund, so, fertile, right? Out of the overabundance of love of the fertile God gives birth to the Son, the Word in all of us. Clearly, okay, so this is where Wikipedia is having problems with this entry, because this person is giving an opinion, but I don't care. Clearly, this is rooted in the Neoplatonic notion of ebullience, boiling over, of the one that cannot hold back its abundance of being. Eckhart had imagined the creation not as a compulsory overflowing, and the metaphor they're giving here is like, like a fountain, basically, right? Of a, just a natural fountain spewing water up, right? So not as a compulsory overflowing, but as the free act of will of the triune nature of deity. So in this, he's referring to the Catholic or Christian notion or idea of Trinitarianism, or the God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. So the Trinity. But as the free act of will of the triune nature of deity. Another bold assertion of Eckhart's distinction between God and Godhead. Okay. So the state of being God. So there's a difference between God and then actually the spirituality of God. And I think I have it. I go into that more here. So I have some other stuff to go into here regarding that. So Godhead. These notions have been present in Pseudo-Dionysius's writings and John the Scots Division Naturae. Sorry, I went into French. Divisione Naturae. I am not a Latin speaker, but Eckhart, with characteristic vigor and audacity, reshaped the germinal metaphors. So those initial metaphors that were presented in those earlier theologians' writings into more profound images and of polarity between the unmanifest and the manifest absolute. Eckhart taught that it is not in God to destroy anything which has being, but he perfects all things, leading some scholars to conclude that he may have held to some form of universal salvation. And what that is basically the Christian universalism is a school of Christian theology focused around the doctrine of universal reconciliation, the view that all human beings will ultimately be saved and restored to a right relationship with God. So out of that, you get like the Universalist Church and other schools of thought in coming out of Christianity. But that's much later, much later. And that's why I think why Eckhart basically was kind of forgotten between the 16th century and the 19th century. And I think it's in the 19th century, the reason that he gets picked up is because of, okay, let me back up a second, because the Universalist Church wasn't founded until the 18th century. So, whatever, these things come around, right? Okay, so I'm going to come back to this contemplative method in a moment, but first I want to go over and talk about some things. I did a little search on Meister Eckhart in Google. You can't see that. All right, let me go to that one. Let's see. All right, show on stream. There we go. Okay. divine core. Yeah, okay, here we are. Okay, so I did a little search on Google's AI and asked about Meister Eckhart's spark of the soul. And we're also talking about like the idea of Godhead, and I think it goes into that here a little bit. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Meister Eckhart's spark of the soul is the uncreated divine core of human consciousness, where God and the soul are one. It represents a ground within, separate from the everyday self, which is directly connected to the Godhead and holds the potential for divine creative wisdom. Okay, so there's the Godhead idea. So let me reread that without the parenthetical information. It represents a ground within, which is directly connected to the Godhead and holds the potential for divine creative wisdom. The Godhead is basically the idea of the essence of God, as opposed to God being an entity. Okay, so the essence of God is separate from God. Key aspects of, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look perplexed there. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, and as you may be as well. So sorry. Key aspects of Eckhart's spark of the soul include uncreated nature. It is a light in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable, which cannot be separated from God. So as we were talking about in this other area where God, let me try to find that little bit where it was like it was unmade and made at the same time, or something along those lines. Oneness with God at his innermost point, the soul's ground and God's are ground. And God's ground are identical. So let me read that again. At this innermost point, the soul's ground. So remember we mentioned up here where the spark of the soul represents a ground within, okay, and directly connected to the essence of God, okay, which holds potential for divine creative wisdom. So in this case, at the innermost point, the soul's ground and the God's ground are identical, often described as a simple oneness or desert of the spirit. Bare encounter, the spark seeks God directly, naked or bare of all images and forms. Continuous presence, it is a burning fire and brilliant light that shines incessantly within a person. The ground, it represents the deepest, most hidden part of the soul. Divine image, it acts as an imprinted picture or ray of the divine nature, acting as the root of human creativity. Eckhart taught that the goal of life is to live from the spark, allowing the divine to flow through and divinize the individual. And it says here, it says dive deeper into AI mode. So we're going to dive deeper into AI mode here, where we can go over here, and it says, so going a little more into the spark of the soul. In Meister Eckhart's mystical theology, the spark of the soul, Middle High German, Seelenfünklein, okay, I'm not even going to try that, is an uncreated and creatable, okay, is an uncreated and uncreatable light within the human spirit that is identical to God. Eckhart taught that this spark is the ground where God is ever present, regardless of the individual's conscious awareness. Core meaning of the spark. The spark represents the innermost essence of a person, described as a fortress or little castle beyond time, space, and all created things. Uncreated nature. Unlike the physical body or the soul's worldly faculties of will, memory, or intellect, the spark is uncreated, meaning it shares the same eternal nature as the Godhead. Some of the readings I was doing, it talked about God could not be perceived through ordinary means, okay, through human means. God is, and God is because God cannot be created. He is uncreated, or God, I won't use he. God is uncreated because God just is. Okay? So this is, I think, where they're getting into this indivisible unity. Eckhart describes the spark as so closely related to God that it forms a unique, indivisible unity where God's ground is my ground and my ground is God's ground. Beyond definition, because it is like God, it is free of all names and forms. Eckhart often used various terms to describe it, such as the light of the Spirit, the tabernacle, or a ray of divine nature. How to access the spark? Well, okay, that's interesting. According to Eckhart, individuals do not reach this spark through effort or addition, but rather through a process of subtraction and detachment. Letting go. Okay, so this is where a lot of people get into Eckhart mirroring what was going on in the East with the Buddha. Okay, so this is very Buddhist in its way, in what he's talking about, but it's very Christian of his time as well. So he speaks in the context of the Christian church, but the concepts he's talking about mirror directly to what the Buddha was talking about. Letting go. To encounter the God within, one must empty the self of worldly desires, attachments, or even preconceived notions of God. Silence and stillness. The soul's mental powers, thought, imagination, and will must become still so that the word of God can be heard in the ground of the soul. Internal focus. Seeking God externally through rituals and places is viewed as a hindrance. The seeker must look deeper into the darkness of their own interior to find the radiant light. Key quotes. Okay, so since we're dealing with Google AI, it's just going to give us the highlights here. There is a light within you, in your soul, uncreated and uncreatable. It simply is. The spark of the soul is the light of God's reflection, which is always looking back to God. Let me back up to that other one. It is uncreated and uncreatable. It simply is, which is also kind of like a very Taoist notion, right? The Tao it just is. And other people I've read have identified the Tao as being sort of equivalent, the Christian equivalent of the Holy Spirit. So it's this sort of like much broader idea of just something that just is. Okay. The spark of the soul is the light of God's reflection, which is always looking back to God. God is a fire, and we have within us, in our core, sparks of that fire. The eye by which I see God is the same as the eye by which God sees me. Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about why I'm bringing Meister Eckhart to light and what he has to do with individuation. So I'm going to go back to our live stream here, and I'm going to switch back over to here. And I'm hoping that this next bit of information will kind of give us that information, that what we're trying to seek. But the interesting thing about Meister Eckhart is he talks about individuals and the relationship to God or to the spirit, the creation, however you call it. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic or not. I think that I believe this is why Eckhart rings true or has some substance, or why people are paying attention to him now in the 21st century, as well as in the past 2 centuries, the 19th and the 20th centuries. I think that this idea of individuation and coming into your own and understanding individuation is more than just like understanding the world. It's understanding the world, understanding yourself, how you fit into it. You are in it, but not of it. and that you have complete compassion for those around you by understanding them without holding your understanding about them against them. Okay. Um, in other words, having complete understanding uh, of the world, and it sort of feels like the idea of transcendence. And Eckhart talks about God as being transcendent. Um, and I have to admit, I just started reading about him last night because I couldn't sleep, and I went back to some tabs that I had open for the last month or two after I'd come across his name, and so I came back to read about him. So my understanding of him and who he is and his teachings are limited. The reason for this video is to bring it to your attention and let you know about who this guy is. Hey, who this cat Eckhart is, and what his how he fits into what Julie has been talking about for the last few videos dealing with individuation. So let me talk. Let me read this bit here. In Eckhart's vision, God is primarily. Oh, okay, I read that. So John Orm Mills notes that Eckhart did not leave us a guide to the spiritual life like Saint Bonaventure's Eternarium, the journey of the soul, but that his ideas on this have to be condensed from his couple of very short books on suffering and detachment. This is what caught my eye. This is exactly the kind of thing that the Buddha talked about. Suffering is like the first tenet of I think it's the Diamond Sutra, one of the sutras, where it's like you were born to suffer. Now that doesn't mean you were born to have a miserable life. What that means is that suffering and living in a difficult time or living through difficult situations teaches you how to individuate and how to move from a very surface level living life to something that's more profound, because you understand things more gain uh, as you gain uh, experience through suffering. And then detachment is by detaching yourself from a lot of the things in ordinary life, or the feeling the need to explain yourself or to be understood, um, and in all manners, right? So detachment has a broader meaning, but I'm just kind of bringing that down. So this is where Eastern philosophies and Western Christian theology can kind of cross paths through the mystical Christian tradition. Okay, so through his books and sermons, according to Mills, Eckhart's comments on prayer are only about contemplative prayer and detachment. So contemplative prayer, not necessarily, oh God, please help me through this time. It's more about meditation and let's see what they say here. Christian mysticism is the tradition of mystical practices and mystical theology within Christianity, which concerns the preparation of the person for the consciousness of and the effect of a direct and transformative presence of God or divine love. So that's what I guess they're saying is contemplative prayer, whatever. Okay, so this one I like too. It's really interesting, and I'm going to get into Jung now. According to Rainer Schurman, 4 stages can be discerned in Eckhart's understanding of mystical development. And those are dissimilarity, similarity, identity, and breakthrough. Now, I have some notes. I found this thing the other day about Carl Jung, and I'm going to go there because Carl Jung was interested in medieval philosophy, medieval theology, but not only that, but he was interested in what's it called? Let me find it. Carl Jung and alchemy. I really hate it when I forget words that are right on the tip of my tongue. But anyway, he was very interested in alchemy. But to Carl Jung, it wasn't about turning lead into gold. Okay, there's a lot of things that are about the alchemist that people really misunderstand. What he considered alchemy was not necessarily a failed precursor to chemistry, but a sophisticated symbolic language for the individuation process, the psychological journey toward wholeness. He believed alchemists were unknowingly projecting their own unconscious transformations onto their chemical experiments, attempting to purify the self just as they sought to transmute lead into gold. This is from Carl Jung from 1957, as some alchemists had to admit that they never succeeded in producing the gold or the philosopher's stone. He says here the stone, but the philosopher's stone. I cannot confess to have solved the riddle of the conjunctio mystery. On the contrary, I am darkly aware of things lurking in the background of the problem, things too big for the horizon. Okay, I don't know why I read that, but anyway. So the 4 stages of transformation. Okay, so what did we say over here? Meister Eckhart, the um, uh, the 4 stages to understanding mystical development, and Carl Jung, the 4 stages of transformation. Now, it's not a coincidence. I'm sure Jung has read Eckhart because I have some quotes of Jung about Eckhart. So let's not think that this is a really wild coincidence. It's not, because one influences the other. And the other wild thing is that Carl Jung died around 700 years after Eckhart was born, so almost to the year. So it's kind of interesting. And the difference between, the age difference, or the period of time between Jung and Eckhart, and then Eckhart and Pseudo Dionysius, is around the same amount of time. It's kind of weird. Anyway, so maybe these things take 700 years to cycle. I don't know. I'm just jabbering. But anyway, so back to this. So let me make sure I'm on the right thing, so you see, okay, we're looking at the same thing. That's awesome. The 4 stages of transformation. Jung mapped the traditional alchemical stages to the specific phases of psychological development. So these are terms that are from alchemy. Negredo, or the blackening, represents the dark night of the soul, which also happens to be the title of a work by St. John of the Cross, who was also a mystic. I forget if he was Dominican or not, but anyway, no, he founded another school. But anyway, Dark Night of the Soul is another mystic, St. John of the Cross, a Spanish monk. Okay, back to Jung. Negredo, blackening, represents the dark night of the soul and the initial confrontation with the shadow. It is a period of decomposition where old ego structures break down. Okay, so Negredo, it maps to dissimilarity, and I'm just going to go back to the page. You won't see it, but I am. Basically, detachment. Dissimilarity. I'm sorry, dissimilarity. Okay, yeah. So we can map the blackening, Negredo, to dissimilarity. Albedo symbolizes purification and the dawning of light after darkness. This stage is associated with the integration of, and these are Jungian terms, anima and animus, and the emergence of the new clarified consciousness. And you can map that to similarity, right? Finding the similarities within oneself, of the darkness and the light, of us and with God. Citronidis, the yellowing, marks the transition from lunar whiteness to solar gold, representing the dawn of wisdom and spiritual awakening. And so that maps also to identity in Meister Eckhart's work. And then finally, Rubedo, which is the reddening, the final culmination of the great work, the magnum opus. It signifies the attainment of the philosopher's stone, a symbol of the fully realized and integrated self. And the final stage in Meister Eckhart's ideas was breakthrough. So Julie and I talk a lot about breakthrough. Breakthrough is that point where I don't know if you want to call it transcendence, but it's a point in your life, and a point in your psychological self, spiritual self, where you cannot go back, right? You cannot continue living the old way of life. You cannot continue living the way you lived before. You can't understand how you lived the way that you lived before. It's just there's no translation. You can see it, but you can't live it. It's sort of like the phrase you can never go home, right? I think there's some more stuff here, but breakthrough is one of those things where it's like you get to these certain points in your spiritual development and your psychological development. And I feel like they're one and the same, right? And it's important to be able to understand who you are and who other people are, maybe their motivations. You might be able to see how they operate, how they might be thinking when you walk into a room. But it's also important to not hold that against them, but to use it for your own benefit, so that you maybe don't fall into traps, like being used by people unwittingly, or letting your own energy leak out into the room so that you get people attacking you or abusing you for being who you are. So it's understanding how to maintain your own energy, your own self, your own spirituality, your own life, but also having compassion for others in where they are in their life. I'm on the wrong tab. Let's see here. Carl Jung. Okay. There were some quotes, and I can't find them now, by Carl Jung. They might be in the Wikipedia area. Okay, so we'll go back to that. So back to live stream, and we're going to go back up to Wikipedia. There's a lot of, influence and study, there's a lot of people who influenced him. And there's a lot of people who were influenced by him. And I talked about the Friends of God. And then Johannes Thaler, John Thaler, and Roman Merswin. Roman Merswin was one of the founders of Friends of God. And the Friends of God were not necessarily, they called them lay people. So basically people who were not of the church. They didn't go through the process of becoming, a priest or a monk or anything like that. So they were laymen. But they were people who formed an association with one another, to the point where they acquired an old monastery so that they could study and pray and be together and exchange ideas and promote their ideas together. Okay, so what it says here is Eckhart was largely forgotten from the 16th century to the 19th century, barring occasional interest from thinkers such as Angelus Silesius. I don't know who that is. So let me also put another caveat here. My interests usually lie in history, and I often have that historical perspective. If I don't know something, I read up on it, and I can kind of place it in a historical context and understand it within a broader context that I bring to you guys here at Book of Hours. But philosophy and spirituality to some degree, but mostly philosophy, is something I'm interested in, but have no grounding for. I kind of understand things on a very superficial level. So that's why I like to read W.D. James, who I've read here on Book of Hours and referred to on our Substack to him. I would point you to him on Substack, W.D. James, or the Philosopher's Holler. Cool guy. I really enjoy. I learn a lot from his readings. Whether I retain it or not, I don't know, but we'll see how things go. So anyway, so this is obviously Angelus is a oh, he was a priest. Okay, physician, mystic, and religious poet. Interesting. Um, he was also of these. Okay, so he was of the 17th century, 1627 to 1677. All right, so during the Baroque period. For centuries, his writings were known only from a number of sermons found in old editions of Johann Thaler, who we mentioned earlier, published by, okay, blah, blah, blah. He was rediscovered in the early 19th century, especially by German romantics and idealist philosophers. Idealist philosophers? Okay, so Immanuel Kant would be one of them. The romantics, German romantics especially, are really an interesting period of time. The artwork and the writings, the books that come out of that period of time, I find really fascinating. And then you get into other mystics in England and France, and it's a very interesting time. The Romantic period placed man in nature, but nature was like very big and broad, and I think that they still kind of separated man from nature, unfortunately, but they at least were starting to understand that we were part of something broader. And anyway, yeah, so that's a very interesting period of time to look into. Franz Pfeiffer's publication in 1857 of Eckhart's German sermons and treatises added greatly to this interest. Another important figure in the later 19th century for recovery of Eckhart works is Henry Denifl, who was the first to recover Eckhart's Latin works from 1886 onward. Austrian paleographer. Interesting. I've never heard that term before. Paleographer. That's really cool. And historian. Okay. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, much Catholic interest in Eckhart was concerned with the consistency of his thought in relation to neo-scholastic thought. In other words, to see whether Eckhart's thought could be seen to be essentially in conformity with orthodoxy and represented by his fellow Dominican, Thomas Aquinas. Another interesting person to look into. If you don't know, he was an Italian Dominican friar and priest, theologian, and philosopher. He is considered one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Catholic theology and Western philosophy. Okay, so this is talking about whether he was a mystic or a theologian. I'm not going to get into that because it's just people kind of arguing. Somebody to check out, Matthew Fox. He's contemporary. American theologian. He used to be in the Dominican order, but he got kicked out for some reason. He talks about Eckhart. Heidegger, they're saying that he referenced Meister Eckhart quite often to support his own thought. I won't get into Derrida. Schopenhauer in the 19th century was influenced by the Upanishads, which are from India. It's the Sanskrit texts of the late Vedic period and post-Vedic periods. Kind of interesting. He's the one that comes out and states that Eckhart and the Buddha are basically saying the same thing. There's other people that come along and said, I don't know about that, but this Rainer Schurman, who I referenced earlier, he's also a Dominican. Kind of points out, while agreeing with D.T. Suzuki, there's certain things that don't that are not common, right? So there's some differences. Okay, I get it. There's some differences. But in psychology and psychoanalysis, we get down to Mr. Carl Jung. And here's the quotes I was talking about. So in Ion researches into the phenomenology of the self. Carl Jung cites Eckhart approvingly in his discussion of Christ as a symbol of the archetypal self. Now, Jung gets into these different archetypes, and the savior, the mother, the wounded healer. They're archetypes of people, of the self, and that's a whole other discussion. Jung sees Eckhart as a Christian Gnostic. Meister Eckhart's theology. Now, I don't know if anyone else would, and I'm not really truly. I couldn't give you a definition of what a Gnostic is either. Again, getting outside of my comfort zone of things. So you can go look it up yourself. Meister Eckhart's theology knows a Godhead of which no qualities except unity and being can be predicated. It is becoming. It is not yet Lord of itself, and it represents an absolute coincidence of opposites. But its simple nature is of forms formless, of becoming becomingless, of beings beingless, of things thingless. Union of opposites is equivalent to unconsciousness so far as human logic goes, for consciousness presupposes a differentiation into subject and object and a relationship between them. Now, these are Carl Jung quotes. Going on, as the Godhead is essentially unconscious, so too is the man who lives in God. In his sermon on the poor in spirit, the Meister says, the man who has this poverty has everything he was when he lived, not in any wise, neither in himself, nor in truth, nor in God. He is so quit and empty of all knowing that no knowledge of God is alive in him. For while he stood in the eternal nature of God, there lived in him not another. What lived there was himself. And so we say, this man is as empty as of his own knowledge as he was when he was not anything. He lets God work with what he will, and he stands empty as when he came from God. Therefore, and so that was Eckhart's quote that Jung is quoting. Therefore, he should love God in the following way. And again, Eckhart, love him as he is, not a not God, a not spirit, a not person, a not image, as a sheer, pure, clear one, which he is, sundered from all secondness. And this one let us sink eternally from nothing to nothing. So help us God, amen. Okay. So pretty deep, and it falls into that idea of a lot of things that go on in Buddhism, which I won't go into because it's too much for this discussion we're having right now. Plus, it's been a while since I've read up on my Buddhist readings. I have a book that has been on my shelf for a long time, and I finally, actually was on my book list to read for a long time. I finally acquired it, and it's been on my bookshelf, another year or two, and it's Zen Bones. I think it's called Zen Bones by not D.T. Suzuki, but another Suzuki, the Zen teacher, the Zen Buddhist teacher, who founded the San Francisco Zen Center. Okay, so Jung summed up his view of Eckhart saying, so a lot of these things kind of like meld, is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of parallels between these two areas. Jung summed up his view of Eckhart saying, the world-embracing spirit of Meister Eckhart knew, without discursive knowledge, the primordial mystical experience of India as well as of the Gnostics, and was itself the finest flower of the tree of the free spirit that flourished at the beginning of the 11th century. Well might the writings of this master be buried for 600 years, for his time was not yet to come. Only in the 19th century did he find a public at all capable of appreciating the grandeur of his mind. Okay, so Carl Jung clearly knew Master Eckhart. Um, and so I guess let's see, what else can we talk about here? That's sort of the end of that um, the Wikipedia entry. This is a portrait. It's a post-mortem portrait from 1366. So um, at least 40 years after almost 40 years after he died. So not sure if the artist really knew what he looked like or not. Um, but anyway, um, Eckhart was a very interesting individual, and I hate using that word "interesting" because nothing else is really coming to mind. Let me come here, and I will stop sharing this. Um, I think what caught my attention was the idea of how he preached to the layman using the vernacular, so his own language, German, to German, uh, folks sitting in the church. Um, Instead of using the Latin, which separates, the churchgoer from the message. I think, especially if you don't understand Latin, right? If you're a scholar, of course, people who were schooled at the time, and I feel like, that was we get into traditions that no longer serve us, and I think that kind of falls into that where the Latin, it has its own beauty and it has its own function, but at some point it was separated from the people, and the 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 liturgy of the Catholic Church was being handed down, and it almost felt like the we talk about the elite, right? Separating themselves from us, and I think this is another example of that. Okay, so he felt that it was necessary to preach to the people in their own language, much like what you would see in the original Christian known as Jesus of Nazareth. Um, I was reading something from the Expressive Egg a little while ago, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a really good piece. It came out in December on Substack. Uh, um, Something about know thy Christian or something like that. And he's really, I like him a lot. He's very sarcastic in some ways, but he also has a grasp of these things that I don't. And he talked a little bit about the early church and how the church ended up being, um, yeah, Christian, know thyself or something. Anyway, he talked about the beginnings of the church and then the medieval periods and the Church of Augustine and the mystics. He talked about Gnostics. He talked about where the Christian church is now, which he has no high opinion of, as I do not. But anyway, my point is that Eckhart, preached to the lay person in their language. He talked about individuation through, the divine and the self can be one, right? So walking in the grace of God, basically, right? That's my interpretation anyway, and requiring that, as Jung would put it, the shadow work, understanding both sides of who you are, um, or other parts. The shadow side is not necessarily the good things that you like about yourself or the good things that you do, or it's more than just that, but it's other parts of yourself than what you present through your persona, which is basically what right here, this that I'm showing to you right now. Um, and I think that Eckhart was kind of touching on that, meaning that there's a ground, right, where we meet the Godhead and where we become one in the same. And I think this was very scary to the to the Catholic Church because they were, even though mysticism had a very long and strong tradition within the Catholic Church, at some point the leadership got very paranoid of that because they were all about the power of the papacy, to speak down to the people who were part of the church. Um, and so I think this was scary to them because it takes away that power and puts the power back into the individual. And I think that's why in my readings, and I didn't get into this, but Eckhart was considered maybe a progenitor of the later Reformation, or not the Reformation, the Protestant movement, starting with Martin Luther in Germany, right? So they were saying that Luther probably had some access to Eckhart's uh, uh, writings through Johann, I forget his name, Tullis or whatever. So there's this tradition that's taking place, and a lot of people are pointing to that Protestant movement probably starting earlier, but coming through Eckhart and then into other people like the Friends of God, and then eventually into the hands of Martin Luther. So interesting. See, that's where my historical mind goes. I enjoy the history and the context thereof. Explaining theology, explaining philosophy and spirituality is not where I'm rooted. I would love to be able to do that, but it's not my seat, right? It's not where I sit. However, it's all the same very interesting to me, and so that's why I wanted to bring this individual up to your attention. I've been on, I don't know how long now. Just over an hour now. Okay, that's about right. That's what I thought I'd do. Let me check the chat real quick and see if there's anyone. Nope, nobody's saying anything. So, all right, that's cool. In the background, I will do this real quick. That is our Japanese magnolia that's in full bloom right now. I took that photo yesterday, and it's in full bloom. It's a beautiful sight to see. I really love it. People come by. Some folks came by the other day to drop something off for us, and they were like, "We love your Japanese maple or magnolia." We live in the magnolia state, and so most of the magnolias around here are, of the North American variety. They are the native magnolias, and they're huge. They're giant. But I've always loved the Japanese maples, or sorry, again, maples, not maples, magnolias. And we do have maples around here, but we have magnolias and live oaks. The Japanese magnolia are all over the Bay Area, in San Francisco and Sonoma and other counties around the area. And so I really do love them quite a bit. They were all over Golden Gate Park, and we would see them around this time of year. So I am so happy that we have a mature Japanese magnolia in our front yard that the previous owner had planted many years ago. I don't know how long ago it's been. I don't know if it's planted post-Katrina or pre-Katrina. I just don't know. But the only problem is it's planted very close to the house, so it has to grow away from the house. But it seems to be okay, and it seems to thrive even in the shadow of the magnificent live oaks that we have growing up front and then throughout our property. And I don't know if Julie mentioned it before, but we have 8 live oaks. They're giant trees, and they're just amazing. I'm always fascinated with them when I look around, look at them, and the life that they support, and the ecosystem that exists just within one tree. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, so with that, I'm going to sign off. I'm JP. This is Book of Hours, and this is another of the Individuation series. And I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope I didn't bore you, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
You can help us continue our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Book of Hours, or leave us a one-time donation at paypal.me/Book of Hours. Or you can use Cash App. Thank you.